An abusive parent is, in a way, one of the most monstrous kind of people in our society. They see it more as an opportunity to completely dominate and control another being. Other types of unfit parents see their children as burdens they'd like to unload. And then there are the children who become missing persons due to non-custodial parents feeling so entitled to possession of their child or children that they take them from the custodial parent and disappear. Today's case falls into one of these categories. Flossie Avenue in Spokane, Washington was a peaceful residential street in a low-crime neighborhood, and living among them in the fall of 1999 was a 33-year-old truck driver named Brad Jackson and his 9-year-old daughter, Valiree. And the two of them lived with Brad's parents in a 3-bedroom house of less than 1,200 square feet. Brad had not had any contact whatsoever with the girl's mother, Roseanne Pleasant, and as Valiree got older, she never heard from her mother, who just wasn't in the girl's life at all. Valiree, with her red curly hair that earned her the nickname Annie, was sort of a teacher's pet. But on the morning of Monday, October 18th, 1999 began with a frantic knocking on the front door of the Jacksons' neighbors. Arlene Horn opened her front door to find Brad Jackson, her neighbor, crying and shaking. By God, I can't find Valiree. As she was in the backyard playing with the dog, he went down to the basement to do the laundry. And at 8:30, when it was time to go to school, he went to the front yard to get her, but she was gone. Brad called the Spokane Sheriff's Department. He told the dispatcher he couldn't find his daughter. 6 detectives and 3 trained dogs were immediately dispatched to the Jackson address. They searched the inside of the house thoroughly, 2 times, but the girl wasn't there. Brad explained that he'd been in the basement doing laundry when Valiree vanished. During the search, one of the investigators, Detective Dave Madsen, found blood spots on Valeree's pillow and some faded blood on her sheets, though he didn't find anything else in the house that would have been used in stopping a nosebleed. He asked if he could take the sheets and pillow, and Brad had no problem with this. As noon struck, police and volunteers from the neighborhood began a larger search effort for Valiree. One of the volunteer searchers from the neighborhood was Shelley Eagland. She then helped in the search while Brad stayed behind at the home. When Karen, Brad's mother, returned home that afternoon and discovered Valiree had gone missing, she prepared a written statement pleading for her granddaughter's safe return. As night began to fall, the search was called off until sunrise. When it resumed the following morning, the sheriff's office expanded their canvas area. They got their first potential lead. 2 days earlier, a 13-year-old girl had been approached by a long-haired man in a flatbed truck who attempted to lure her into his vehicle. Detectives connected this girl with a police sketch artist. Investigators also wanted to connect with Roseanne Pleasant, and Roseanne's family wondered if she had perhaps returned and taken her daughter. 3 days after Valeree's disappearance, there was still no sign of her. Roseanne's brother, John Stone, had suspicions of his own, and those suspicions fell squarely on Brad Jackson. Roseanne's family actually had long suspected that Brad was the person responsible for their daughter Roseanne's disappearance 7 years earlier. Her life with Brad was a nightmare. In John Stone's last conversation with his sister before her disappearance, she told him she was afraid of Brad and that he had a bunch of lye lying around, and she knew that lye is often used to dissolve dead bodies. 7 years later, with her daughter Valiree now missing, Valeree's uncle began to suspect that Brad had done it again. Police were also suspicious about aspects of Brad's phone call, the way he was able to recall in such vivid detail everything Valiree was wearing that morning, how he was so specific about times. Another person who was growing suspicious of Brad was Shelley Eagland, the teacher's aide. She had reached out to John Stone, and she confided in him that Brad hadn't left her alone since the disappearance. Shelley wasn't on board, like how he seemed more concerned that police suspected him than he was about Valeree's whereabouts. And he told Shelley at one point, "It's my story and I'm sticking to it." Valiree had been having conflicts with a woman her father had been dating named Danette Schroeder. When they lived together, Valiree and Danette clashed hardcore. The police at this point were growing increasingly increasingly suspicious of Brad, and he could feel it. Among the items they found and took into evidence were Valeree's prescription bottle of Paxil and Valeree's diary, which they found in her bedroom. And the most interesting thing in her diary was an entry dated October 12th, 1999, in which she complained that her father wouldn't leave her alone in her bedroom. And during the examination of the bedding they had confiscated, the forensic lab found 2 red pubic hairs that they'd later determine resembled Brad Jackson's. The investigation team tested the wash cycles on the laundry machines in the basement, and they found inconsistencies in the timeline of Brad's account. His story just wasn't adding up. They impounded Brad's vehicles, and what they left behind was, at the time, a fairly new technology. They left GPS devices in both of Brad's vehicles. They were theorizing at this point that Brad had killed his daughter Valiree and buried her somewhere. Brad himself told the media that he was being looked at as a suspect and offered to take a polygraph test so the police would shift their focus off of him. Although the sheriff's office contradicted this. They reported that detectives had given Brad the opportunity to take a lie detector test, and he told them at the time that he'd have to think about it. You think he'd welcome the publicity and support if he truly was committed to seeing his daughter found. So lead detective Dave Madsen tried to hasten things up by approaching Brad and making it explicitly clear that investigators believed he had murdered his daughter. And shortly after this conversation, Brad Jackson had made an interesting trip, one with multiple stops. Brad drove to his rented storage unit on Highway 2. He was there only briefly, before then driving to Danette Schroeder's house, where he stopped for a brief period of time. After this, he went on a 60-mile drive to a remote area known as Loon Lake. Once he was there, he turned onto an unmarked logging road and stopped in this area, spending approximately 45 minutes at this location before returning home. Brad Jackson and his family were familiar with this location, and they would go hunting here. And then 4 days later, the GPS showed that he drove to another wooded, desolate location about 5 miles from his house. He spent about 15 minutes there, and then from there drove the 60 miles back to the logging site he'd visited earlier that week. That same day, police went to the Vicary Road location near Brad's parents' house. They did find some valuable items left behind: 2 plastic shopping bags and duct tape with red hair attached to it. They traveled to the logging site, and the cadaver dogs led them to an area of freshly excavated dirt. They began digging, and inside, they found the body of Valiree Jackson lying face down. Brad Jackson had buried his own daughter. The medical examiner determined that Valiree had died from asphyxiation. Jackson again visited his rented storage unit, and afterward he visited his friends Kelly and Sean Bash and asked to borrow their pickup truck. He drove back to the remote logging site, and when he was there, he discovered that the grave he dug and placed Valiree in had been dug up and was now empty. And later that night, a warrant was put out for Brad's arrest, and when police stopped him in Spokane, he was acting erratically and seemed to be suicidal and had a shotgun in his vehicle. He was immediately charged with murder in the first degree. The plastic bags they found in the shallow grave that Valiree had been moved from, traces of Valeree's blood were found inside of them. And these bags were identical to dozens of other plastic bags stored in the kitchen of the Jackson house. Fingerprints were found both inside the plastic bag and on the duct tape, and those fingerprints matched the father, Brad Jackson. But telltale bruising around her face and nose revealed that Brad had smothered her to death, and after he killed her, investigators believed he then dressed her in the clothes he later described to the 911 dispatcher, which is why he was able to remember them in such vivid detail. It was learned during the investigation that Brad had told his sister he wanted to marry Danette, and they'd surely be together if only it weren't for his daughter, Valiree. So it was believed that the reason Brad Jackson killed his own daughter was to remove her as a perceived obstacle between him and the woman he'd been seeing. At his arraignment, Brad Jackson pled not guilty, and at his trial, he admitted to digging both graves and burying his daughter in them, but he still claimed he did not kill her. He told the court that she had died from an accidental overdose of Paxil. The jury didn't buy anything Brad said. They found him guilty of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to 672 months in prison. The faculty and student body of McDonald Elementary School painted a tree in Valeree's memory. It remains there to this day.